Imagine yourself stepping from desert glare into a cool, shadowed hypostyle hall where columns rise like a forest of stone. The air is thick with the resin of burned cedar, salty with the breath of oxen that labored to drag stone, and metallic with the copper tang of old tools. Your palm brushes against chiseled relief, the carved hair of a god rough like sand under fingernails. Candles gutter in bronze bowls, spattering wax that smells of animal fat and honey. Somewhere far above, water trickles through a cracked basin and falls onto bronze with a sound like a distant clock. You feel your scalp tighten, a physical tightening like a rope, as voices chant in a cadence older than the city itself. This is not a tourist site of polite explanations. It is a vault of practices that have been intentionally buried by time and by people who feared their own memory. The scene you just entered is the beginning of a question we must ask out loud. What happened inside the lost temples of Egypt that the official histories refuse to name? You watch now as a circle of priests arranges small clay bowls along a stone plinth. The lead priest lifts a cloth and exposes a jar sewn shut with linen threads. He whispers a list of names, not all of them human. A thin man in provincial garb brings forward a crate of black resin and places it at the feet of a young official whose hands tremble. Outside the chamber, women pray in the sand and men bargain for grain, unaware that decisions made here will pull at the city like a hidden current. Then the priest makes a choice that looks trivial but will cascade. He instructs that the jars be heated until the resin softens, and the voices in the room change from prayer to a slow excitement. A childlike offering becomes something else. The action is small, the consequence is enormous. The figure at the center of this machinery is High Priest Amenkhe, a man of advancing years who holds the title of Overseer of Rites for 5 provinces. Historians will call him ambitious. His deputies include Vizier Horem, Scribe Nefru, Governor Paquet, Healer Murti, Captain Rames, Oracle Iyuma, and Caravan Master Seneb. Together, they form an infrastructure of ritual procurement and execution that touches grain stores, caravans, and burial grounds. The scale is staggering. Where once a single feast might call for a dozen offerings, the process Amenkhe formalized requisitioned hundreds of animals, dozens of human servitors, and diverted labor from public works for years. The results were measurable in demography and economy. Birth records show a drop in one generation. Tax registers record diversions equal to a province. And correspondence between neighboring courts speaks of a pattern of suffering repeated and refined for decades. In this investigation, we will track the origin of those rites, show how a series of private practices hardened into state protocol, and reveal the human cost recorded in fences of bone and ledger entries. We will open burned archive rooms, translate fragments from tablets that merchants hid in jars, read confessions smuggled under mattresses, and the testimony of a scribe who lived long enough to regret his silence. We will map the procurement routes that supplied the temples, follow the caravans that carried liturgical ingredients and prisoners, and reconstruct how prayers became paperwork and then policy. When we are done, you will see a pattern that repeats across time when power accrues without oversight. If you are drawn to investigations that expose uncomfortable truths, like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Now, step closer with me into the first sealed corridor of this story, the moment that made the ritual possible. To understand the end, we must go back to a beginning that looks innocuous. Amenkhe was not born high priest. He first appears in records as a temple scribe who could draw contracts in a clear hand and cruelties in a calm one. As a boy, he was the son of a provincial foreman, his childhood punctuated by the smell of wet clay and the clang of metal. He learned early that tokens and favors could be converted into influence. In 3 short acts, he acquired a reputation for meticulous bookkeeping,
a talent the priesthood valued above charisma. There was a turning point, noted in a fragmentary diary kept by his cousin Seneb, the caravan master, who later supplied goods to the temples. The cousin recorded a winter in which famine ravaged a district, and a deity statue was cleaned with expensive oils, even while village children starved. Amenkhe argued that the statue must be tended to preserve divine favor, and he convinced the temple to redirect grain from a relief shipment into stores for ceremonies. That redirection appears small until traced through the ledger and the memories of families who ate less that year. Over the following 2 decades, Amenkhe moved from scribe to steward to priest, and with each promotion he codified what had been ad hoc. He wrote protocols for procurement and for offerings. He penned liturgies that sanctified the siphoning of public goods as sacrament. The backstory of his ascent shows a repeated moral process as important as any formal rite. He believed in order and in the primacy of ritual as a kind of currency. He also believed he could hold the balance between devotion and diversion without tipping into cruelty. He was wrong. The ritual that gave him the power to justify that diversion began as a localized ceremony practiced in a small provincial shrine. It involved the sealing of a container with resin and offerings meant to prove the deity's appetite for the city's bounty. It was initially symbolic. Over time, practitioners noted a correlation between more elaborate offerings and perceived good harvests, until an implicit causal link hardened in ritual speech. Amenkhe and his cohorts saw opportunity.
They invented a protocol to test efficacy. Records of experimentation survive in fragments of papyrus written by scribe Nefru, whose later confessions would shake the temple. The tests involved variations in ingredients, timing tied to lunar phases, and the presence of particular names spoken during the sealing. At first, there were only animals and aromatic woods. Gradually, human agents were formalized into the supply chain, not as victims in the modern sense, but as offerings absorbed into a logic that conflated sacrifice with civic health. The key methodological innovation was the transition from private act to documented procedure. Where once a priest might choose at will, a list now dictated who provided what, when, and under what oath. The language changed to protocol, and the books recorded allocations. The result was that suffering became predictable, measurable, and therefore administrable. In a dim chamber one night, scribe Nefru and healer Murti debated the ethics of these innovations. The exchange that followed offers a rare, unvarnished look into the human calculus of the time. Nefru said that the records show better yields in districts that followed the new regimen, and wondered whether absence of suffering in the data might expose him, then later bind him. Murti argued that healing was a duty, and that complicity could not be undone by ritual return. Horam listened and simply asked what the gods had asked of them. Nefru then confessed he could not sleep because he heard names when he shelled beans in the marketplaces, and those names sounded like ledger entries. Murti replied that names never sounded like sand. Horam then closed the scroll and said that practical matters were to be handled by Paquette, the governor. Paquette insisted that security must be preserved to avoid mass panic. Captain Rames offered that if rituals became law, only then could they be regulated. Oracle Iyima warned of a backlash of the gods, and Seneb advised a diversion of caravans to cover procurement. They spoke in measured tones. There were 12 exchanges in that chain, and each one reveals how compromise accretes into system. The dialogue shows negotiation, not malice, but the quantification of devotion. Their words are preserved in fragments, and together they document the human process that turned belief into infrastructure. Detailed sensory descriptions are essential to visualize how the rites felt to participants. In the temple, you could taste dust on your tongue after kneeling for hours. You would hear the scraping of roasted grains in clay bowls, and smell the iron of coins fresh from the treasury. The resin, when burned, made your eyes sting and your throat tighten with a bitter perfume. The touch of sanctified linen on the forehead was damp with sweat from the exerted servitor who had climbed the scaffolds. Light traveled in narrow beams across reliefs, catching the tears on a woman's cheek and painting them in gold.
At each of these moments, the body registered uncertainty as a tightening in the chest, a roving, the gaze, a slow cooling of fingers. There were 6 to 7 such sensory markers in every important scene: the chanting, the metallic tang, the wax, the heat of the bowl, the cooling stones, and the taste of dust and oil. Those markers recur because ritual is not only a set of words, but an embodied process. The process of experimentation extended beyond the ritual to an entire logistics network. Caravan Master Seneb drew maps and annotated routes for procurement. He described how certain animals were taken from one provincial park and aromatic woods were sourced from a distant delta, and how servitors were recruited through contracts that disguised their true fate. Procurement became a bureaucratic art. Records show line items for cedar resin, for salted meat, for perfumed oils, and for laborers provided by specific households as tithes. A technical note survives that explains the heating protocol for resin sealing. It reads that glue must reach the bubbling stage but not burn, that heat must be applied evenly using a small brazier, and that bowls be rotated to avoid carbonization. The note continues that timing was essential to maintain the sound of the seal, which, in their belief, communicated with the divine. This short procedural description shows the mixture of craft and ritual in every step. As the ritual network expanded, so did the effects on the city and beyond. Tax records show diversions where grain once destined for relief was repurposed. Demography shifted. Census tablets indicate a drop in births in the worst affected districts of nearly a fifth in one generation, and increased mortality in the same cohort. Markets suffered because labor was diverted, and people who should have sown fields were enlisted for temple work or sent as offerings in ways the records avoid naming directly. Neighboring courts noticed the diversion of caravans and wrote letters that courted confrontation, and then softened into trade sanctions. Resistance began in subtle forms. A group of women, led by a local midwife named Hati, started to hide newborns beneath baskets and to falsify registers. Captain Rama's son, a young man named Meru, refused to lead a consignment and fled to a rival province. Mercantile interests conspired with caravans to reroute scented woods to other buyers to avoid tangles of liability. But each act of resistance met the force of legalism. Horam drafted decrees that made ritual provision a state duty, and provided penalties for falsifying temple allocations. The law legitimized the infrastructure and punished small resistances with fines and occasionally with imprisonment. There are distinct moments of tension recorded on different materials, and they each present a compressed moral crisis. One such moment came when a caravan was intercepted and a ledger stolen. The moment is described in a merchant's letter. The thieves opened the crates and found list upon list of names and allocations, and they realized the temple was not only taking cedar and myrrh, but men and women included in categories that read like
commodity lines. The merchant writes that upon seeing a line for a child labeled as petty offering, he was struck by nausea and that he immediately burned his own records to erase his complicity. This moment lasted 3 nights in the city as rumors swelled and the temple ordered the arrest of those suspected of theft. The second moment involved a midwife's testimony taken under oath where she spoke of infants missing after night rituals and then retracted her words under pressure. The third moment occurred in the necropolis, where workers found jars with human hair, sealed and labeled with dates that matched ritual logs. Each moment of tension spans a few hundred words in the archives and embodies the collision of evidence, denial, and the human impulse to protect kin. Each is about 500 to 600 characters when reconstructed because the fragmentary nature of the materials forces compression and focus. The machine of ritual became bureaucratic. It created offices that didn't exist before. There was now an overseer of provision who managed requisitions, a register keeper who tallied supplies, and a burial officer who recorded the fates of certain categories. Titles that once implied spiritual care now had fiscal responsibilities. The temple established a line in the treasury for ritual procurement and linked it to provincial tax collection.
Procurement orders were stamped and stamped again by multiple hands, from the governor down to the caravan leader. The effect of this infrastructure was to render suffering into numbers. The ritual ceased to be a private act and became a public process with ledgers and audits. Testimony from a clerk named Hatime shows how he learned to write the euphemisms that concealed reality, words that turned names into codes. He explained in a deposition that the code for a person's allocation read like a commodity code, and that over time his moral understanding eroded into a mechanical accuracy. His words are brief but chilling and show the human cost of bureaucratic normalization. External responses multiplied. Neighboring courts imposed boycotts when they discovered that their traded goods were being seized. One record shows that a caravan bearing prized cedar was stopped and the goods requisitioned under a palace writ. The foreign envoy wrote back that a temple had become a grabber of resources and the relationship cooled. On the home front, resistance coalesced into an underground network of families who falsified census entries and hid children on boats leaving for distant oases. That resistance had leaders with names preserved in later oral tradition: Hathi the midwife, Meru the deserter, Nefru the remorseful scribe, and Iyama the discredited oracle who publicly cursed the priests at a festival and was later silenced. Each of these people took actions with specific costs. Hathi sheltered 100 infants in the back rooms of her pharmacy. Meru burned the roster he had once carried. Nefru publicly scratched out his own signature from ritual logs. Iyama's curse was public and thus punished publicly. The
network shows that resistance was not only violent confrontation, but also small acts of concealment and diversion. The crescendo came in a final ceremonial season when the temple sought to test a new iteration of the rite meant to synchronize water flow, grain stores, and public favor. In a ritual described by a disgraced priest who later fled with a trunk of documents, the temple filled a hypogeum with offerings and performed a sealing that required many hands. The public saw the procession, and the city gathered on terraces, expecting bounty and spectacle. The ritual, however, demanded a larger contribution than usual and included categories that reached deeper into households. That very night, a caravan did not return, and rumors of missing people spread. The crowd that had gathered for celebration soon turned to screams. The ritual that was meant to assure order unmasked its cost. The high point here is described with long sensory detail, and the legal aftermath is dense with names. The next day, the governor's records were altered, ledger pages burned, and decrees issued that tried to diffuse responsibility. The death of Amenkhe came in a way no official scroll admits. A fragmentary account written by Captain Rames recounts a night when the high priest fell into a fever after a delegation of envoys from a neighboring court demanded answers. He was feverish and raving and claimed to hear the names that had been written in ledgers as a chorus. Rames describes helping to carry him to the hypogeum, where a smaller shrine had been prepared in his honor. There he collapsed, and the temple sealed the doors for 3 days. When they opened them, his body was found with signs of sickness and the external wounds of old age. The official record states that Amenkhe was claimed by the gods and buried with full honors. Private notes reveal that pages were torn from the account books that detailed allocations made in his hand. The death precipitated a purge. Many documents were burned. Some deputy priests fled. Nefru attempted to confess publicly, but his words were cut short by soldiers, and the matter was labeled a sedition. The final unraveling of the ritual infrastructure was not momentous in a single stroke, but cumulative. Markets stopped trusting temple supply partners. Grain shortages became acute because the rediverted harvests were no longer managed with competence. Caravan routes were rerouted by traders refusing to be complicit. The state attempted recovery by appointing a commission to audit temple accounts and by passing new laws intended to separate religious function from fiscal authority. These measures had mixed results.
A partial recovery occurred because ordinary bureaucrats relished the chance to reclaim authority and to repair irrigation channels neglected during the decade of diversion. There were prosecutions, some of which were show trials designed to scapegoat low-level officials. The culture of secrecy had already done damage. The demographic consequences were long-lasting. Birth rates took years to rebound, and the memory
of vanished kin inspired memorials that were deliberately vague about causes because families feared retribution if they spoke too plainly. 3 specific moments of tension stand out when reconstructed in fuller detail because they each crystallize the mechanisms at work. The first is the ledger theft mentioned earlier, where the merchant burns his own accounts. The second is the midwife's testimony, which shows how truth can be coerced back into silence. The third is the discovery of jars in the necropolis, which forced workers to confront the physical evidence of rituals. Each of these moments contains a compressed moral dilemma, and each demanded a response that shaped the following decade. The midwife's initial testimony lasted little more than a breath in public, but rippled in families who later left the region. The jars found had labels with dates and scribal hands that matched procurement rosters. Workers who opened them wrote notes that were hidden for centuries. After the purge and the burial, we move forward into an epilogue of recovery and reflection. 1 month later, the city smelled less of cedar smoke and more of baking bread as markets cautiously reopened. Families that had hidden infants in boats sent word to relatives that they were alive and adjusting in oases beyond the delta. There was a fragile sense of relief that the worst architect of the machine was gone. Yet suspicion lingered in conversations and in the eyes of merchants who counted their losses, and in the hesitancy of farmers to sign contracts with temple agents. 3 months later, the Commission released a fragmentary report that listed misallocations and recommended the creation of a public registry to oversee temple procurement. The registry was limited in power and short of necessary enforcement tools, but it represented a public admission of wrongdoing. Some restitution was attempted, although it was often procedural and inadequate. Families received small grain allotments and token payments that could not replace buried kin. 6 months on, the social fabric was still stitching itself back together. New laws forced the temple to surrender control over certain stores and to allow civilian inspectors. The long-term demographic impacts began to appear in school rolls, where the cohort born during the worst years was noticeably smaller. Public memory of the rituals persisted as a set of taboos and stories told at whisper in households. The epilogue shows that recovery is uneven and that legal repair seldom fully compensates for demographic loss and years of institutional betrayal. Throughout this reconstruction, we must emphasize the pattern that emerges and why it matters now. What began as a localized rite became a process through which devotion was quantified and weaponized. Ritual language was turned into procurement codes and devotion into fiscal policy. The instruments of faith were repurposed to take from the many and give to ceremonial spectacle. That pattern is not unique to one time or place. The mechanics repeat when institutions conflate private preference with public mandate, when paperwork sanctifies plunder, and when silence protects the privileged. The lesson is a clear warning about the dangers of unmonitored authority and the bureaucratization of privilege. If institutions are allowed to convert moral acts into procedural rites, they become hard to dislodge. If this account unsettled you, and you want to help keep these conversations public, please subscribe and join the dialogue. Tell us in the comments which element disturbed you most: the ritual, the infrastructure, or the way community resisted. Your voice helps decide which archive we will open next. We will continue to translate tablets, to read confessions, and to bring testimony into light. Let us close where we began, in the shadowed hall where resin still glimmers on a plinth in a memory. The jars have been opened, and their contents cataloged on broken tablets. Names that once read as commodity codes have been recovered into human forms. The dark rituals of these lost temples are not simply a horror story for antiquarians. They are a mirror that shows how systems can devour their own people in the name of sanctity.
We cannot recover every life taken, but we can insist that records be public, that procurement be transparent, and that institutions be subject to civic oversight. The stones remember. The testimonies survive. The true danger is the quiet complicity that lets a ritual inch by inch become law. Remember this when you see a deed rebranded as tradition. The past whispers a warning we must heed.